the Redcoats. One American private later described their situation, quote, "Fatigued by our labor, having no sleep the night before, very little to eat, no drink but rum, the danger we were in made us think there was treachery, and that we were brought there to be all slain." End quote. But the colonists' passion made up for their lack of discipline. These men really wanted the British Army out of Boston. As the battle on Breed's Hill raged on, the citizens of Boston climbed onto their roofs to watch the fight. It wasn't pretty. British cannons were literally blowing off limbs and even heads of the rebel fighters. American Colonel William Prescott saw another problem. The colonial position on Breed's Hill allowed the British to flank them on both sides. So, Prescott ordered another breastwork built down the east side of the hill, to the peninsula along the Mystic River. Prescott also sent another regiment with 2 cannons to build a fort on Bunker Hill to stop the British advance. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, the Redcoats managed to land at the bottom of Breed's Hill. More British troops landed on the banks of the Mystic River. But that second extended breastwork hindered the Redcoats, and around 3 o'clock, American Colonel John Stark arrived with reinforcements. Stark told his men to form 3 separate firing lines. He then walked out 50 yards from the battle's front and drove a stake into the ground. He ordered his men not to fire before the British troops reached that marker. His exact words might have been, quote, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." End quote. Back then, British soldiers were taught to march forward in 3 orderly rows. So the first line came, ordered forward by British General Howe. When the first Redcoats reached that stake in the ground, Stark ordered, "Fire!" The British line was slaughtered. Then the second line approached. Stark waited until the soldiers reached that stake in the ground, then called out, "Fire!" Another slaughter. The third line of Redcoats marched forward and met the same fate. It didn't help the British that the terrain had tall grass that hid stone walls and ditches. Some of the soldiers were tripping forward, but their worst problem was tactical. The British were using 6-pound cannons, but only had 12-pound shot. That meant the cannonballs were the wrong size for the cannons. Meanwhile, the Americans delivered a near-continuous volley of fire. When British General Howe reorganized his troops for a third assault, he wisely shifted his infantry into deep columns instead of those orderly rows that exposed every man in the line. The Americans kept firing, but soon ran out of ammunition. At that point, the colonists decided to retreat in order. That's a military term for when an army keeps firing as it leaves a battlefield, protecting its rear guard and its other troops. In the end, the British took Breed's Hill. But what had they gained? One grassy hill above Boston Harbor. Their losses were so much bigger. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded in this battle. That was almost a 40% of their forces in the area. The Americans suffered too, with about 450 men killed or wounded. But to the rebels, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a victory. One ragged band of ordinary men had taken on the world's most powerful army and probably would have won if they hadn't run out of ammunition. At that point, the Revolutionary War was on. Many more fights lay ahead as Americans fought for their independence from their British king. Who fought? The British Army was a big reason why the colonists were paying such high taxes. Before the Revolutionary War, the British had fought in something called the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. In that war, England fought France, mostly in areas around Canada and the New England colonies. Eventually, King George III signed a treaty that ended the French and Indian War, but all that fighting had created massive debts for England.